It is our great pleasure to be hearing from Professor Stephan Lewandowsky today. He's the chair of the Cognitive Science Department at the University of Bristol. I invited Dr. Lewandowsky here because he is an expert in misinformation and what variables determine people's acceptance of scientific findings, which couldn't be more relevant today than ever. With the recent elections in the US, as well as all of the events going on around the world, I think his work is obviously important today, but is going to have long-standing impacts for years to come. And it will be interesting to see how his findings unfold in the next 10, 20 years. He has published over 200 scholarly articles, book chapters, and has received numerous awards, some of which are the Discovery Outstanding Research Award from Australian Research Council in 2011. And one of my favorites from his list of many, I'm just picking out two, is he's the fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry for his commitment to science, rational inquiry, and public education. That is quite an honor. In addition to all of his scholarly research, he's also an advocate for minoritized groups in cognitive science. He's the chair of the diversity committee at Psychonomics, which I think is a really great contribution as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephan Lewandowsky.
Thanks, Les. Wonderful to be here. Well, even though I'm not there, I'm at home, but I'm used to that now. I haven't been anywhere else for a long time. So I presume you can now see my screen. No one is objecting to me saying that, so I'm assuming it's there. So yes, the knowledge Dementors. Who are they? Who are Dementors anyway? Well, for those of you who don't know Harry Potter or have forgotten about Harry Potter, the Dementors are these creatures that suck intelligence out of anything next to them. And it makes it difficult to sort of deal with life when that happens, especially because you can't find these people because they're not people, these Dementors, they're hiding under cloaks. So what does that have to do with psychological research? Well, I think it does when it comes to dishonesty, misinformation, lies, deception, and so on. Now, to put this into a sort of a broad 50-year context, I want to expose you to a very brief history of lies. Now, I should perhaps apologize that I'm using American presidents to illustrate this, but as it turns out, we know a lot about American presidents. They're important all around the world. And sometimes they're a bit challenged by reality and things that they have to navigate with difficulty. Let's put it that way. Now, I think we all know that Richard Nixon didn't speak the truth when the Watergate scandal unfolded. We have some suggestion that Ronald Reagan wasn't quite honest about Iran-Contra. Bill Clinton, well, no doubt he lied about his sex life. And then it goes on and on and on. And now we have Donald Trump still for some time, who just lies. And what is interesting here, I think, is that there has been a distinct shift over time that is very important to understand between the type of lies or deceptions that politicians used to tell us and what they're doing now. And one aspect of this is just the sheer volume of falsehoods. Now, according to the Washington Post, Donald Trump made more than 22,000 false statements up through August this year. So that was a few months ago. And that, I think, pales, I mean, everybody else pales by comparison to that. And in addition to the quantity, there's also, in my opinion, been a shift in the quality, a qualitative shift in the type of misinformation or lies that politicians have been telling. Now, I'm now using terminology that was proposed by McWright and Dunlap a couple of years ago, where they differentiated between what they called systemic lies and shock and chaos disinformation. And I think that is a crucial shift that has occurred during the last 5 to 10 years that we have to understand. Now, what do I mean by systemic lies? Well, what I mean by that is that whatever misdirection, misperception, deception, whatever you want to call it, whenever politicians in the past have told falsehoods or spun reality beyond recognition, they did so for a purpose. I mean, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which didn't exist at the time, was a perfect example for that. You know, that was just a creation based on, at the very least, exaggeration, but actually, I think, willful deception relating to very marginal intelligence. But the people involved in that never denied the existence of Iraq. And Richard Nixon never denied the existence of a break-in. In all those cases, lies were carefully curated and they served a purpose, and they subscribed to a knowable and common reality. Now, in differentiation to that, I would argue that for the last 5 to 10 years, we now see misinformation that is accompanied by complete epistemic insouciance. By that, I mean that, reality no longer matters. There is no contestation for a shared reality. It is all blasting out thousands, millions of statements on social media, in the media, by Twitter, that are totally confusing and confused and often serve no apparent purpose. And that is sort of, I think, something that is important to realize, because later on we'll see how the countermeasures to this are affected by that. Not only do lies have no apparent specific purpose in politics anymore, when they're being challenged, there's evidence that instead of rebutting the challenge, very often these protagonists just resort to ontological gerrymandering. They're basically saying, oh, well, truth isn't truth, as Rudy Giuliani said on national TV. Or they create alternative facts, or they're dismissing the idea of facts or truth or evidence. The last two people here you may not know, they're British personalities that are fairly well known here and have very much in common with some American politicians. So if we assume that this is the case, and I think there's good enough evidence for that, then the question is, why is this happening? Well, one possible reason, and it may not be causal, but at least it is associated with this. One of the possible reasons is that it actually doesn't matter. If you look at Donald Trump's approval ratings during his presidency, as the number of falsehoods went up by 10 or 12 per day, made no difference to his approval ratings. It made no difference to his electoral success last week, which was considerable given the circumstances. He lost, but he was not wiped out by any means. So that is one answer. Now, here's another thing that becomes psychologically very relevant. Time and again, when you ask Americans, the American public, whether they consider Donald Trump to be honest, you get this surprising result, namely that 76% of Republicans, it's usually about that, 3-to-1 among Republicans, consider Donald Trump to be honest. There's a number of polls of that nature out there. So, notwithstanding the shock and chaos disinformation, politically, that hasn't done harm to Donald Trump. And moreover, among his own party, he's considered to be honest. Now, that is psychologically interesting. And it is also, as it turns out, I think, politically and morally, philosophically problematic. Because if you go back to analyses of the Nazis and fascism, totalitarianism that were published in the 1950s and 60s, then you very often find statements of this type. That if you lie too much and nothing is agreed on as a common truth on which to build politics, then you just take away the sense and the ability to take your bearings in the world. So it is no longer a problem of just being misled, for example, into believing that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. No, it goes beyond that, because it becomes so noisy and chaotic that people will no longer believe anything. And once you have those situations, things are quite problematic for democracy. And there's pretty good analytic conceptual evidence based on retrospective analyses of totalitarianism in the 20th century that this type of disinformation destabilizes institutions and facilitates authoritarianism. And what we're witnessing right now, this very moment, with allegations of voter fraud that are unsubstantiated by any evidence, is part of that pattern. Now, what I want to talk about is the people, agencies, institutions, and societal processes that are driving these tendencies. And my title or label for those people are knowledge dementors. I want to talk about three things: conspiracy theories, diversion, and micro-targeted manipulation, all of which has psychological implications. So, first point, conspiracy theories. I want to look at conspiracy theories in the context of science, and in particular, climate science, though not exclusively. We have plenty of evidence, both anecdotal and empirical, that denial of climate change, climate science, is associated with conspiratorial rhetoric. Here are just two examples of that type of rhetoric. There are plenty more, and I'm not singling out this particular individual, but you can find that anecdotally wherever you look. Now, here's the problem, or the first problem. This links back to what I said before about shock and chaos disinformation eroding democratic institutions. Well, when it comes to conspiracy theories, we have plenty of empirical evidence to support that contention. For example, the mere exposure to conspiracy theories has been found to decrease people's intentions to reduce their carbon footprint, or indeed to participate in politics. People become disengaged. They don't want to be involved in politics after they hear a conspiracy theory, even if they don't believe it. Exposure is sufficient to undermine democratic engagement, or indeed trust in institutions. In this particular study, a fallout from exposure to conspiracy theories is that people lose trust in government institutions that are completely unconnected to the conspiratorial allegations. So if somebody has some conspiratorial attack on, let's say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, as in this study, then people become less trusting of their local school board. So there is transfer to unrelated government institutions. And that is, to my mind, concerning and supports my proposition that shock and chaos disinformation is harmful to democracy. Now, what I want to focus on, having set the stage for this being a problem, what I want to focus on are the people who are expressing these conspiracy theories. And I want to tell you about one study, one of my recent studies that differentiates between two ways in which people might express conspiratorial rhetoric or might be believers in conspiracy theories. Now, there's no question that on the one hand, some people are more prone to conspiracies than others. I mean, we can predict on the basis of personality variables how likely a person might be to engage in conspiratorial rhetoric. If a person does that, then we can predict from that the fact that they're also going to believe other conspiracy theories. So there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that some people are just predisposed to believe in conspiracy theories. Now, we've known that for a long time. What I want to add to this today is that there are also pragmatic reasons to engage in conspiratorial rhetoric. And to understand that, let me start out by telling you that free market endorsement, that is, in the particular case of my studies, I ask people 5 questions about the free market. Those who are most enthusiastically endorsing free markets are far more likely to reject the findings from climate science. They say there is no climate change, and it's just a non-issue to them. So we have to know that. And indeed, that association is pervasive. Just to tell you how strong it is, there's a dozen studies or more out there showing this. There's really no doubt. Here is one I like because it spans 24 different countries. And what I'm showing you here in the data are the effect sizes of the association between conservatism or free market fundamentalism or libertarianism, whatever you want to call it. These are all a cluster of attitudes that tend to go together. The strength of the association between those and the rejection of climate science. And as you can see in the United States, that is a very large effect, larger than in the rest of the world, although it's also present in the rest of the world. So we can build on this foundation to now ask, okay, what are the consequences of that strong association? Well, what I'm arguing is that if there's overwhelming scientific evidence that is perceived as a threat to worldview, or also one's lifestyle, one's profits, although here I'm focusing on worldview. And if that overwhelming scientific evidence on climate change is based on pervasive agreement amongst scientists, as it is, as we know it to be, then where does that leave a person? Well, what's your get out of jail for free card? Well, one thing you can do is to say, all the scientists agree, therefore they're in on a conspiracy. So what you do is you say the evidence is so strong, and everybody, instead of saying the evidence is so strong that all the scientists independently agree, you think they must be in on a conspiracy. Now, if that is the case, then we should be able to pick that up. And the study I'm telling you about sought to do exactly that. And what I did was to first ask people to tell me what their perception of the scientific consensus was relating the fact that HIV causes AIDS, the fact that CO2 causes climate change, and that vaccinations protect against the disease. So I asked people that using questions such as this, out of 100 climate scientists, how many do you think endorse this belief? And then respondents just told me whatever number they thought was appropriate. Now then, immediately afterwards, I presented participants with the fact that there was a consensus. So instead of asking them, I just said, oh, by the way, there is one. There is a consensus. And I then asked how much of the following reasons contribute to this agreement? And there, participants had to rate the relative contribution of these various factors. Scientists independently assessing the evidence, funding availability, groupthink, political pressure, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you look at all these reasons that I gave people to choose from, you'll find that there's one about the evidence, and everything else is kind of hinting at a conspiracy, isn't it? These guys are, pursuing an agenda. They're suppressing dissent. And that indeed is a very common accusation against climate scientists. So the other thing I did was to ask for people's political views, in this case scored as conservatism, again using some items relating to the free market among others. I express it as conservatism, but it could have been flipped around. I could have called it liberalism, then the sign changes of the correlations, but nothing else is different. And the question I'm now asking is, how do political views predict the presumed reasons for a scientific consensus? Remember that we already know that conservatism is strongly associated with denial of climate change. How does that affect the presumed reasons for a scientific consensus? All right, and here's where it gets to be interesting. Because remember now, I asked people about 3 different scientific facts. The link between HIV and AIDS, the fact that climate change is due to CO2, and the fact that vaccinations are saving lives. What I'm showing you in this graph are correlations between conservatism with what the same people thought were the reasons underlying the scientific consensus. I've already filled in the graph for AIDS, and it turns out all those dots are gray. The reason they're gray is because those correlations are not significant. In other words, people's reasons, their presumed reasons for why scientists agree on AIDS, are not at all related to politics. There's no relationship. Whether you're conservative or liberal doesn't matter. You weight each of the different factors equally. And now look at climate change. The pattern is radically different. All hell breaks loose. All of a sudden, everything that's conspiratorial is positively associated with conservatism, and the one bit about evaluating evidence has a negative association. So all of a sudden, politics matters, and it expresses itself as endorsement of conspiratorial reasons for the consensus. And these are the same people as in the top panel, just asking a different question. All of a sudden, politics matters. With vaccinations, well, halfway in between. Not as extreme as climate change, but it is, again, the case that the more conservative you are, the more you think that the reasons vaccinations are medically supported is because of some hidden agenda and, funding pressure, groupthink, that sort of stuff. Now, the magnitude of this differentiation between the different reasons happens to link up very nicely with the known magnitudes of the association between conservatism and anti-vaccination and climate denial. We know from before that there's a very strong association between conservatism or libertarianism and climate denial, much stronger than there is between conservatism and anti-vaccination, although there is that too. And those magnitudes translate into the separation here. Now, what I haven't told you is that I also, for the same people, again, I asked them about their dispositional tendency towards conspiracy theorizing, using some questionnaire kind of, that probe their belief that there are secret forces at work that control the world and all that. Now, what you find is this pattern. Now, all of a sudden, AIDS becomes relevant again And the more conspiratorial you are, the less you think the AIDS consensus is based on evaluation of evidence, and the more you think some of these other conspiratorial reasons are relevant. For vaccination, it's even bigger, this differentiation. But for climate change, it's almost gone. So all of a sudden, for the very same people, all of these data are from the same sample. For the very same people, the dispositional conspiracism isn't as important for climate change as it is for vaccinations and AIDS. And yet again, if you map that divergence between evaluating evidence and the conspiratorial reasons, if you map that to the known correlations between conspiratorial attitudes and anti-vaccination and climate denial, and indeed AIDS denial, you again get this mapping of the magnitude known from other research onto how far apart these different reasons are. Now, why is that important? Why, what am I saying here? Why does this matter? Well, I think it matters because in the case of climate change, but also other sciences, political views are one of the strongest predictors of people's attitudes. And climate change is just the one factor that matters. Now, what my study then shows, my interpretation of this is that if people are confronted because of their worldviews with something they have to explain away, namely an overwhelming scientific consensus, then they deploy conspiratorial rhetoric. But it's not because they're predisposed to do that. It's only because the politics are inconvenient, and so they explain it away with a conspiracy theory. Now, I think in a sense that's good news, because it means that in many circumstances, articulation and endorsement of conspiracy theories can be tactical, strategic. It's a rhetorical device, a get out of jail card, rather than dispositional. And it turns out that countermeasures, corrective measures, are more likely to be successful with people who engage in this rhetoric for convenience rather than dispositional conspiracy theorists. And just as a brief aside, I mean, there's a lot more that could be said about conspiracy theories, and all the stuff that can be said, we've summarized in a recent handbook that tells you more about conspiracy theories and also how to meet them, which is available at that link. All right, so much for conspiracy theories, but that's only one part of the contribution to shock and chaos, disinformation. Here's another one, and that relates to how the media cope with this. That, of course, is crucial. And conventional wisdom, by that I mean, political science for the last 30, 40 years, the conventional view is that the media are responsible for agenda setting in politics, in the United States specifically, but I think in most democracies. And there's some evidence to support that. However, things have changed over the last few years. Twitter and other social media have come along, and with Twitter came Donald Trump, and he is a master of using Twitter for his political ends. And I want to examine one of the ways in which he arguably has been using Twitter to set agendas. Now, Lakoff came up with this taxonomy here between preemptive framing, diversion, deflection, a trial balloon, and that was all based kind of just on, but you look at the tweets and you kind of think, yeah, well, this is what's happening. Now, what I want to do is tell you about a study that actually is coming out tomorrow, as it happens, at 10 a.m. in the UK in Nature Communications, where we analyzed the diversionary nature of Donald Trump's tweets. Now, this got triggered a few years ago, before, in fact, Trump assumed office, and you may still remember this, that Donald Trump started tweeting vigorously against the Broadway production of Hamilton because its cast pleaded for a diverse America in the presence of Pence, you may recall, and Donald was very upset about that. Kind of like you wonder why. Why was he upset? Well, I don't know. Here's one possibility. And this is showing Google Trends data from the time when this took place. And what I'm showing you here is the spike of interest by the public in Trump and Hamilton. Keywords Trump Hamilton in Google searches. They went up, wow, like that, back down again. So what? Well, look at the blue line. There's a little bump here, that one. Guess what the blue line is about? The blue line is for Trump University settlement, Google search terms, which happened to be on the same day as the Twitter activity against Hamilton. Now, I don't know if you recall this, but Trump had to settle the suit by paying $25 million. Including a $1 million penalty to the state of New York, basically admitting fraud in his university. Well, the public didn't seem to care, did they? Why not? Well, I don't know that, but it certainly was very convenient that they were all talking about Trump and Hamilton, wasn't it? So could this be something systematic? That's the question we asked in our study. And the basic idea is this. Supposing Donald Trump systematically diverts attention from things he doesn't like, then every time the media covers an issue that is harmful to him, he should do something to divert. And if that diversion is successful, then maybe the media would drop that issue, conceivably, sometime later. So you should have a positive association between inconvenient coverage and something else that he tweets, followed by a reduction and hence a negative association with subsequent media coverage. I mean, that's kind of like what it would look like if Donald Trump was doing that, either knowingly or, unknowingly, unwittingly. I don't know. I don't care. Statistically, this is what you should see. In our study, we operationalized that by looking at the Russia-Mueller investigation and coverage of that in the New York Times and ABC headline news. And we analyzed the coverage, we analyzed Donald Trump's tweets, starting out with keywords that we thought reflected his political strengths, such as jobs, China, immigration. And there's a lot of independent evidence that, if you dig deep into this, then you find that actually those are his preferred topics. Until the pandemic came along, he wanted to talk about jobs. He talks about immigration all the time. He talks about China all the time. So, there's evidence that this is stuff he loves. So maybe if there's too much Russia Mueller, he'll just say, oh, okay, I'm going to talk about jobs. And then maybe God knows what happens to the media. So here are some of the details. I can, skip over that in large part, but we looked at 2 years worth of coverage in the New York Times, ABC News, Donald Trump's tweets. We started out by choosing 3 keywords in his tweets, namely China, jobs, and immigration, or CJI from here on, to see if there's anything there in these a priori keywords that we chose ahead of time. And here are the data. Now, the numbers are probably pretty small on your screen, so here they are in bigger font. These are regression weights between the coverage. The top one is New York Times, Russia, and Mueller. The second one is the ABC headline news, and the third one is the average of the 2 combined. What you find is that whenever the media talk more about Russia and Mueller, Donald Trump talks more about China, jobs, or immigration. That's statistically highly significant, and it's a reasonable sized effect. Now, what about the other side of the coin? Does that in turn then depress media coverage? Well, that's the regression weights in the bottom right, which are using yesterday's tweets on his preferred topics to predict today's coverage. We've also done it today's tweets to tomorrow's coverage, makes no difference. But you go from the previous day to the media coverage the subsequent day, and you get negative correlations that are either marginally or actually, by conventional levels, significant. Meaning that not only does Russia coverage trigger more tweets about his favorite topics, those tweets in turn are followed by reduced coverage of Russia and Mueller. Now, if you break this down further, we did this in all sorts of possible combinations of these keywords, then you find that it shows up for jobs in China, but not for immigration. So let's see how robust this finding is. Maybe that was a fluke somehow. So what we did was to examine all of Donald Trump's Twitter vocabulary, excluding rare words, stop words, and words about Russia and Mueller and collusion, because we didn't want it to be kind of like recursively about itself. We wanted to look at anything else he would talk about to divert. And we did a few control analyses, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. Now, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of graphs that are kind of cool. But to understand the graphs, I have to explain what I'm plotting. And what I am plotting in the graphs that are forthcoming is that each word pair that was tweeted is plotted in this two-dimensional space using the coefficient, actually the t-value of the coefficient, for a regression where the main predictor was the Mueller-Russia coverage. And the same data point is plotted along the y-axis as a function of the regression weight for the reduction potentially of Russia-Mueller coverage the subsequent day based on that word pair being tweeted. Okay, so each point is in XY space, where X is, the X dimension is the response to coverage, and the Y dimension is the media's response to the tweets. So I'm expressing both Donald Trump's responses and the media's responses to Donald Trump. Now, of course, I can't make any claims about causality yet, but just to show you what is being plotted, that's what we're doing. Now, if there's no relationship at all, then everything should be in the middle around the zero, because then, it doesn't matter what the media does, has no effect on the tweets. The tweets have no effects on the media. They should all be in the middle. If Donald Trump is successfully diverting from Russia Mueller, then not only should he be tweeting more about his whatever, his favorite stuff, thus moving to the right, but the media should also report less Russia Mueller, hence moving down. So we should have a point cloud in the bottom right quadrant. Let me start out just to introduce you to what's going on by talking about gardening. I told you we had some neutral keywords. I think gardening is kind of neutral. So we went to the New York Times coverage and we counted the number of times they talked about gardening. And the point cloud you see here is, well, pretty much smack in the middle. The red lines are the significant cutoffs. There's no evidence that Donald Trump gets excited about gardening. On the contrary, you can argue that gardening puts him to sleep because he's tweeting less about everything. And the New York Times doesn't care. They're not responding to that. Now, what we also did, just as a control, is to create a null distribution that is superimposed on that point cloud that we get by just randomizing the Twitter timeline. Here it is, same data, but this time we randomize it. And guess what? Of course, it is all smack in the middle, almost by definition, because if I take a random timeline of tweets, trying to associate that with the New York Times, oh my God, I mean, if there were an association there, I would worry about something a great deal. How could that happen? Well, it doesn't. And here's the contour plot showing you that the very same data, when randomized, are precisely where they should be. So that gives us a null distribution based on the very same data that we're trying to assess. What happens when the New York Times talks about the economy? Well, Donald Trump does a lot. He talks a lot more about a lot of things. Remember now that each point here is a pair of words, and we don't know yet what these pairs of words are. We just know he tweets a hell of a lot more when the New York Times talks about the economy. But it makes no difference to the New York Times, really. There's the occasional dot down here, but, you know, nothing that I would write home about. And I'll show you two more. I'm building up to the real result here. I'm showing you two more neutral coverage examples. We looked at skiing and vegetarian cooking. The word clouds here tell you the 50 most popular words in the New York Times for those topics. And they kind of confirm that these are stories about what you'd expect. You know, vegetarian restaurants, cooking, people hanging out, recipes. It's all just, you know, exactly what the coverage is about. Does Donald Trump care? Nah, not really. He's not into vegetarianism. In fact, there's nothing for vegetarianism. There's a little bit perhaps for skiing, but the media don't care. There's no response. So I've now shown you lots of points, lots of graphs in which nothing happens because everything is in the middle. Now, what about Russia and Mueller? That's the New York Times. New York Times reports Russia and Mueller. Donald Trump not only tweets a hell of a lot more, but the next day, the New York Times significantly reduces its coverage of Russia and Mueller. That is the first time we've seen this point cloud down here in the bottom right quadrant. ABC News, headline news, precisely the same. There are some tweets that trigger a reduction in coverage the next day by ABC News of topics that we know are not to Donald Trump's liking. What is it that he is tweeting about? Remember now that each of these points down here in this bottom right quadrant is a pair of words, so we can look at what it is he tweets about. Well, here's the word cloud for the top 50 or whatever words in his tweets. And again, it's about jobs, but also about tax, about China, about crime, North Korea. He's heavily into North Korea. And you can just get a sense of this being topics that are important to Donald Trump and that he wants to draw attention to. And it works. So what can we conclude? We can conclude that Donald Trump's tweets divert to his political strengths. I'm not making any claim that he does this intentionally. I can't do that. I have no idea. But it just so happens that negative coverage or problematic coverage is followed by tweets over here. And it also just so happens that the diversion works. New York Times and ABC reduced that inconvenient coverage the next day. And they don't do it for vegetarianism and gardening or anything else, any of the other stuff I looked at. So part of shock and chaos, a blizzard of misinformation or information, social media information, part of the consequence is that politicians can now set the agenda, and it looks as though, well, it's certainly compatible with the idea that that diversion then reduces that inconvenient coverage. And of course, the New York Times isn't doing that on purpose. but statistically, we can show that they do. That brings me to my last issue I want to talk about, namely micro-targeted manipulation. Now we have to talk about Facebook. There are some things in this that should worry you, and I haven't mentioned them yet. I mean, I talked a lot about shock and chaos and democracy and all that. Okay, yeah, but nothing that I've talked about is as concerning to me as this. And that is that we know with great confidence that knowledge of Facebook likes by a person permits identification of a person's personality with greater accuracy than one's spouse. These data show accuracy of identification of a user's personality, and the spouse is at 0.58 on the big 5 personality dimensions. And if you get 300 likes, then the computer is going to do better. So now there's a lot to explain and unpack here. I don't have time to do that, but just take my word for it that Facebook knows more about you than your own spouse, assuming you have liked 300 things during the time you've been on Facebook. Now, there's nothing totally surprising about it because Facebook actually has a patent on this that they took out 6 years ago, and in which they say that the inferred personality characteristics may be used for targeting, ranking, selecting versions of products, and various other purposes. Now, what are those various other purposes? Well, there's a number of them. The first one, of course, is trying to sell people stuff. Here is a study that actually tested this on Facebook. They looked at more than 3 million participants, so they don't have a power issue. They customized cosmetic ads to appeal to extroverts and introverts. And they selected their audience or classified their participants based on likes, based on the study I already told you about that let a machine learning algorithm infer personality of users. And just to give you like an example, guess what? The one on the left, that's an ad for extroverts. The one on the right is a cosmetic ad for introverts. And they manipulated it so that the 2 types of ads were fully crossed with the 2 types of participants, classified by their personality. And what you find is this. In a nutshell, whenever the ads match the audience, so introverted ads for an introverted audience or extroverted ads for an extroverted audience, when there was a match, they sold more. And in this experiment, they actually not only looked at click-through rates, but actual dollar amounts of what they sold. They actually sold people lipsticks or whatever the cosmetics were. And this is the effect of targeting ads to the personality of a user without their knowledge. Now, okay, fine. You know, maybe lipstick, that's okay. In a sense, you know, I mean, why not? Perhaps. It's a little more problematic the moment you get into political messages because Facebook permits micro-targeting to exploit people's unique vulnerabilities. Now, there's a very complicated backstory to this that I don't have time to unpack, but basically, as a first approximation, I'm happy to make that claim that I can, on the basis of available knowledge, select a target audience on Facebook that I understand sufficiently well to exploit their psychological vulnerabilities based on their personality. I have a pretty good guess. And of course, we have the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But now I think everybody has heard of that, where Cambridge Analytica harvested personal data from 87 million users, probably more, may have been way more, and used them to customize political messaging. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this kind of worked. We don't quite know how effective it was. I don't want to overstate the case. Got to be very careful there. But there is a lot of hints at this from not too long ago that this manipulation is ongoing. And irrespective of whether it's effective or not, I would argue it's a serious problem in a democracy because no one else sees these ads but the person who's being targeted and the originator of the message. Now, what that means is that there is no rebuttal possible. I can't rebut a message that was custom designed for whatever, introverts, to exploit their vulnerabilities and to make them stay at home and not go to vote or whatever, some political message. So it takes politics out of the public sphere and into secret manipulation. Now, some people will say, oh, but there's an ad library, and Facebook is indeed publishing all its ads now, but they don't publish the targeting information with it. So you cannot rebut a given ad to the exact same audience that got the first one. That is not possible. And even if they did publish that, there's still no guarantee that the ad would be shown because of the way there's another algorithmic issue here that I also don't have time to get into, known as ad tech, that is undermining any possibility of rebuttal further. Now, the UK Parliament did an inquiry on this, and they called Facebook a digital gangster. It's not really the style of parliamentary committees to use that language unless they really are triggered into saying these things. And people know that. This is a global survey from last year where 75% of people said that the social media companies are responsible for online distrust. So I think some caution is in order. So what can we do about it? Well, one thing we can do is to reverse engineer micro-targeting. And let me tell you in the last 5 minutes about a study where we did that. The idea is as follows. If we know that people are being micro-targeted for whatever commercial reasons or political reasons, can we teach users something about themselves that allows them to detect that? Can I become attuned to manipulation? What we did in this experiment is to assign people at random to one of two conditions. In the experimental condition, we gave people an extraversion, introversion questionnaire and then told them what their score was. In the control condition, we had a sham personality questionnaire that's of no interest. We then, in both conditions, asked people to detect or classify ads as whether or not they targeted them. Is this ad targeted at me? That was the basic task that subjects had to do. And then in each condition, they got the other questionnaire at the end. But that's when the experiment was over and it no longer there was no longer much point in that. So to explain what this looked like from the participants' point of view, after they take their personality test, I'm now talking about the experimental condition. Extroverts and introverts likewise were given these definitions. They were actually much longer than these brief words, but effectively you can get the picture. Extroverts are, pronounced engagement, enthusiastic, action-oriented, blah, blah, blah. Introverts are quiet, deliberate, less involved, And first people were told these generic definitions of introversion, extroversion. Then they were given personalized feedback, such as this one here. They were told where they ranked on the distribution of introversion to extroversion for people of their age. And it was truthful. We always provide truthful feedback. That's easy to do because there's norms. You know, this has been administered millions of times, probably. We know a lot about introversion, extroversion. So there's no mystery here. We can tell people this. So here's somebody who's extroverted. There's somebody who's introverted. We always expressed it as being, you know, in the direction which they were leaning. And so this person here, you know, they're an extreme introvert. We tell people this. And we tell them what this means. And then we say, oh, do you think this ad is targeted at you based on what we just told you? Yes or no? That's all we asked them to do. We used the same ads from the previous study that we know appealed to introverts and extroverts and had been standardized and calibrated and all validated and all that in the previous study. So we have very little ambiguity here about whom the ads were targeting. And here's the results. On the left, you have the violin plot and a box and whisker plot for the boosting condition where people were given personality feedback. And on the right, you have the control condition where they did a very similar thing, but the questionnaire wasn't relevant to the personality dimension under examination. And what do you find? Well, first of all, in the control condition, people are above chance, but they're not that good. They're okay, but they're not that good at picking ads targeted at themselves. But now look at the experimental condition. I mean, most of the responses are above 80 and 90% correct. The median is at 90% correct. This is a major effect. We boost people's accuracy of detection by 30%, from around 60 to around 90, give or take. That is big, and it was easy. Just a few item questionnaires, bit of feedback, and there it goes. And we've replicated this, of course, with different scenarios, and it replicates. And the size of that effect depends on how much feedback exactly we provide people. For the experiment I've just shown you, we get the biggest effect, about 30%, by providing exact feedback about their personality plus this generic feedback. So what can we conclude? Well, people can identify when advertisement is targeted at them. We don't know yet, but we're hoping that this might be a first step towards resilience. That by itself might be sufficient for people to say, whoa, 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 somebody's trying to manipulate me. And of course, the obvious next question to ask is, well, can we do this for political messages? And if so, is detection sufficient to allow people to make their own choices about how they respond to those messages rather than to be manipulated without their knowledge? Okay, great. And that is the 3 knowledge dementors I wanted to acquaint you with. And I thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions, of course.